The pen they handed me was heavier than a pen has any right to be, and I remember thinking that even my own hand had aged in the weeks since Wilbur died. The conference room at Pruitt and Associates smelled of furniture polish and cold coffee. Desmond sat across from me in a suit that cost more than my first car, and beside him his sister Judith Ann kept folding and unfolding the corner of a document as if she could not decide whether to be nervous or pleased. Corinne Desmond's wife watched me over the rim of a glass of sparkling water. Their lawyer, Howard Pruitt, slid the papers across the table and told me in that smooth, patient voice of his that I was finally doing the sensible thing, so I signed. My signature looked small at the bottom of all that careful language, the signature of a woman who had supposedly understood at last that she had no place here. Desmond allowed himself a smile. Judith Ann let out a breath she had been holding for what looked like an hour. For one moment they believed it was finished, that the grieving widow had finally lain down and let them carry off everything her husband had built. Then the door opened, and a woman I had met only days before walked in carrying a second folder. Her name was Naomi Frost, and she did not work for Howard Pruitt. She set the folder on the table, opened it without hurry, and began to read aloud. One paragraph, then another. Howard's smooth voice had gone completely silent. And when she reached a single name, a name that none of those people had ever once heard cross my lips, a name that belonged to no one sitting in that room. I watched the color drain out of Howard Pruitt's face until he looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on the wrong side of something he could not take back. But I am moving too fast. To understand why a lawyer went white over one quiet name, you have to go back 3 weeks to a morning when the funeral flowers were still fresh, and I still believed I had lost everything that mattered. The lilies were still on the hall table when they came for me. I was in the workshop at the back of the house when I heard their cars on the gravel. After 20 years, I knew the sounds of that house the way you know your own breathing, and I knew the particular crunch of Desmond's wheels, fast and impatient, and behind it, the softer arrival of Judith Ann's. I did not get up right away. I had a row of small amber bottles in front of me, and I was doing the only thing that had kept me upright since the morning Wilbur stopped breathing, which was working. Measuring. Blending. The bench in front of me held rosehip and calendula and a tincture I had been refining for almost a year, and the room smelled of green things and clean alcohol and the faint sweetness of beeswax. This was where Wren Botanicals had been born. Not in the gleaming offices downtown where Desmond liked to be photographed, and not in the boardroom where men in good suits talked about margins and market share. It was born here on this scarred wooden bench in the years when Wilbur and I had nothing but a good idea and each other. I came to him already knowing how to do this. Before I ever met Wilbur, I had spent half my life learning the patient old craft of plants, apprenticed to a woman who taught me which flowers heal and which only pretend to, and when I married him at 44, I did not arrive empty-handed. I arrived with the formulas already in my head, and the first of them already written in a notebook that nobody else could read because the shorthand was mine. I was the one who built every blend the company ever sold. I was the one whose hands knew without a scale what 8 drops of one oil would do to a base, what too much heat would steal from a tincture, how to keep a thing alive on a shelf without filling it with the cheap poisons our competitors used. Wilbur ran the business, the contracts and the money and the men, and he ran it well. But the part people paid for the part that made a stranger open a jar and breathe in and feel for one moment cared for that part came out of this room and out of me. Wilbur used to stand in that doorway with 2 cups of coffee and watch me work, and he would say that I owned the only part of the company that could never be copied. He meant it more literally than I understood at the time. I am not sure his children ever believed it at all. To them, I was the woman who mixed the creams, a sort of glorified housekeeper their father had grown fond of, and the brand was a name on a building and a number on a balance sheet. They found me there, of course. Desmond came in first, glancing at my bench the way a man glances at a hobby, and Judith Ann followed with her arms crossed against the cold she always seemed to feel. "Harriet," Desmond said. He had a way of saying my name that turned it into a small correction. "We need to talk about some practical things, while they're still fresh." I capped the bottle in my hand. "Your father has been gone 9 days. "Which is exactly why," he said. "The longer the company drifts, the more value we lose. You understand that. Dad would have wanted us to be responsible." Judith Ann would not quite look at me. She looked at the bench at the window at her own hands. "We know this is hard," she said. "It's hard on all of us. It is a strange thing to be told that a death is hard on everyone by the people who appeared only for the funeral. In the last months when Wilbur was failing, when I was the one learning to read a chart and crush a pill into applesauce and sit awake counting his breaths, his children had been busy. Desmond flew in for an afternoon once with a photographer in tow for some announcement that never happened, shook his father's hand as though they were closing a deal, and was gone before dinner. Judith Ann sent flowers twice, and a card with someone else's handwriting on the envelope. There were whole weeks near the end when the only voices in this house were mine and Wilbur's, when he had the strength and the low murmur of the hospice nurse who came on Thursdays. I bathed him. I read to him when his eyes grew too tired for print. On the bad nights, I lay on top of the covers beside him with my hand on his chest so that I would wake if the rhythm changed. I had been alone in this house with my husband while he died, and now his children stood in my workshop telling me how hard it had all been on them, and asking me before the flowers had even browned to sign my life away. I should have seen even then that there was something feverish in their hurry. People who are merely greedy can afford to be patient. Greed waits. Greed lets probate run its slow course and collects at the end. But Desmond did not want to wait a single week, and that should have told me something, because if there was one thing Desmond had always been, it was lazy. He had spent his whole adult life avoiding effort. Now suddenly he was a man on fire to finish something fast, and I was too deep in grief to ask myself why. We went into Wilbur's study because Desmond preferred rooms where he could sit behind a desk. He laid a folder on the leather top, the same desk where my husband had kissed my forehead every morning for 20 years, and he opened it with the small theatrical care of a man who has rehearsed. "The will is very clear," he said. "The shares in Wren, the controlling interest, the trademarks, the downtown property, all of it passes to Judith Ann and me. That was Dad's intention. Family assets stay in the family. In the bloodline," Corinne added gently from the doorway as though she were softening something. "And me?" I asked. Desmond turned a page as if the answer were an afterthought. There was a sum. It was not nothing, and it was not enough, and the precise amount was chosen, I think, to look generous on paper and to feel like an insult in the room. There was a clause requiring me to sign away any claim to the company, to the formulas, to the name. There was a date by which I was expected to clear my things out of the offices and step back from any role in the brand I had spent 20 years building with my own 2 hands. "You'll be comfortable," Judith Ann said quickly, hearing the silence. "We made sure of that." "You'll be comfortable," Judith Ann said quickly, hearing the silence. "We made sure of that." I have thought a great deal since about the way Judith Ann said that. Desmond delivered the whole thing like a man reading a verdict, but his sister kept reaching for softer words. Comfortable fare what Dad wanted, as though she were trying to lay a blanket over something cold. She could not hold my eyes. Every time I looked at her, she found somewhere else to look, and there was a tightness around her mouth that I mistook that morning for grief. It was not grief. I know that now. It was the particular misery of a person who has agreed to do a thing she cannot quite live with, and who is hoping that if everyone keeps using gentle words, it will turn out not to be as bad as she fears. Desmond had no such tightness anywhere on him. Desmond had decided long ago that the world owed him, and a man like that never loses sleep over collecting. I looked at the photograph on the corner of the desk. It was not of Desmond, and it was not of Judith Ann. It was a small picture of Wilbur and me on a beach the year we married, both of us squinting and laughing at something neither of us could ever remember afterward. I had given him that picture in a cheap drugstore frame, and he had never once replaced the frame in all the years we could have afforded better. And now it sat on a desk that was apparently no longer mine, even to dust. "Your father promised me," I said, and I hated how thin my voice sounded, "that I would never have to worry." "He told me that more times than I can count." "People say things," Desmond answered, "and then they make a will. The will is the part that counts." Howard Pruitt arrived an hour later, summoned by a phone call I was not part of, and he sat across from me with the grave kindness of a man who has decided which way the money runs. He had been the company's lawyer for years. I had served him dinner in this house. He cleaned his glasses while he spoke the way he always did when he wanted to seem thoughtful. "Harriet, I'll be honest with you because I respect you," he said. "You could contest this. You'd have grounds to make noise. But a fight like that takes years. It eats everything. Legal fees, your health, your peace. And at the end of it, even if you win something, you'll have spent the best of what's left of your life in a courtroom across the table from your husband's children." He let that sit. "My advice as someone who knew Wilbur is to take what's offered with your dignity intact. Sign, grieve, and build something quiet for yourself. Don't let this turn you into a bitter woman." It was good advice if you did not look at it too closely. It was the kind of advice that sounds like a friend's hand on your shoulder and is underneath a door being shut. I told him I would think about it. I told all of them I needed time. Desmond said, of course, take all the time you need, and in the same breath reminded me that the clock had already started and that these things only got harder the longer they sat. They left me alone in the study as the afternoon light slid across the floor. I sat in Wilbur's chair in the worn place his body had made over 20 years, and I let myself believe for about an hour that Howard was right. That the kindest thing I could do for myself was to stop, to take the money and the quiet and disappear into a small life and to let his children have the rest. I was 64 years old. I was tired in a way that sleep does not touch. I did not have it in me to fight 2 lawyers and 2 grown children over a business that without Wilbur felt like a house with all the windows broken. That was the night everything turned, although I did not understand it yet. I could not sleep, which by then was ordinary, so I came downstairs in the dark for tea, and I saw a light moving under the study door. Not the steady glow of a lamp left on. A moving light low to the ground, the kind a phone makes when someone is using it as a torch. I stood in the hallway in my robe, and I listened, and I heard drawers. I heard the particular sound of papers being lifted out and pushed back fast, the sound of searching that has stopped being careful. I opened the door. Desmond was on his knees at the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet. Judith Ann stood over the desk with a stack of folders in her arms, and when the light hit her face, I saw something I had not expected to see. Not greed. Fear. Plain animal fear, the look of a person who has lost something and is running out of places to look for it. "What are you doing in here?" I asked. Desmond got to his feet too fast and put on a smile that did not fit the moment. "We were looking for the insurance documents," he said. "For the estate. You should be resting, Harriet." It was a good lie. Smooth and immediate. But I had been married to a businessman for 20 years, and I had watched 100 deals close at our dinner table, and I knew the difference between a man retrieving a document and a man hunting for one. They had not come for insurance papers. Insurance papers do not make a person go through every drawer in a desk with their hands shaking. And here is the thing that I turned over and over that night, lying awake until the windows went gray. If everything was already theirs, if the will was airtight, and the company was won, and the widow was beaten, then what could possibly be left in this house that frightened them so badly? People who have won do not search like that. Only people who are afraid of being caught search like that. I let them leave. I said goodnight as if nothing had happened, and Desmond said something about not wanting to disturb me, and they were gone within the hour, their cars pulling out of the gravel and into the dark. I went back into the study and I sat in my husband's chair again, but I did not feel beaten anymore. I felt the first thin thread of something I had not felt in 9 days, which was suspicion, and suspicion, it turns out, is a cousin of hope. I want to be honest about what changed in me that night, because it was not courage, not yet. It was something smaller and harder. For 3 weeks I had let myself be handled because I was grieving and because they had told me in 100 polite ways that I was a foolish old woman who did not understand business. And for 3 weeks, I had half believed them. But fear does not lie the way words do. I had just watched 2 grown people tear apart their dead father's study, at midnight hunting for something with their hands shaking, and you cannot fake that. Whatever they wanted, it was not the money, because the money was already theirs. They had already won the money. So there was something else in this house. Something my husband had left behind that was worth more to them than everything they were about to inherit, and worth so much that they were willing to crawl on their knees through his drawers in the dark to make sure I never found it. Which meant Wilbur had left it for me to find. I started going through the desk myself. Slowly, the way Wilbur did everything, because Wilbur was the most careful man I ever knew, and if there was something here worth fearing, then he had hidden it, the way he hid everything in plain and patient order. I went through the obvious places first, and found nothing but the ordinary debris of a life-old receipts warranty cards, a birthday note I had written him years ago that he had kept. My throat closed on that one and I had to stop for a while. It was in the small, shallow drawer above the knee-hole, the one that always stuck, that I found it. Tucked behind a strip of old business cards, face down, was a single card from a firm I had never heard of. Frost Legal. A name, Naomi Frost, and a phone number, and on the back, in Wilbur's small square handwriting, 2 words that made no sense to me at all. Open everything. I did not know what it meant. I did not know who Naomi Frost was, or why my husband, who had used Howard Pruitt for years, would keep the card of a different lawyer hidden behind his old contacts with a note to himself on the back. I held it for a long time. Then I put it in the pocket of my robe, and I went finally to sleep with my hand closed around it like a woman holding a key she has not yet found the lock for. The phone rang at 8:20 the next morning. I almost did not answer, because by then the calls were all the same condolences that wanted something, or Desmond checking that I had not changed my mind. But the number was one I did not recognize, and after the night I had just had, I was done ignoring things I did not recognize. Mrs. Ashford. The voice was steady and low, a woman's voice careful in the way of people who choose their words for a living. My name is Naomi Frost. I was your husband's attorney. Not the firm you've been dealing with. Me, privately. There was a small pause, and I could hear her deciding how much to say over a phone line. Wilbur left me very specific instructions. If anything happened to him, I was to contact you within a certain number of days, and I was to do it before you signed anything with his children, or with Howard Pruitt. I sat down on the bottom stair. I still had the card in my robe pocket from the night before. I took it out and turned it over and looked at his handwriting, open everything, and I felt the floor of the last 3 weeks tilt very slightly under me. I think you should come to my office, Naomi said, as soon as you're able. There are things about your husband's estate that you need to know, Mrs. Ashford. Things they have not told you, and things they are counting on you never finding out. But I need you to understand something before you come, and I need you to hear it clearly. She paused again. Do not sign anything, not 1 page. Whatever they put in front of you, whatever the date they give you, whatever they say it will cost you to wait. Do not sign anything until you and I have spoken. I looked at the lilies on the hall table, brown now at the edges, and I thought of Judith Ann's frightened face in the moving light, and Desmond on his knees in the drawers, hunting for a thing he could not find. All right, I said. I'll come today. Frost Legal was nothing like the firm Howard Pruitt kept downtown. There was no marble lobby, no wall of glass looking out over the river, no young men in narrow suits carrying coffee for other men. It was 2 rooms above a bakery on a quiet street, and the whole stairwell smelled of bread. And when I reached the top, a woman in her 50s opened the door herself because there was no one else to open it. She had gray threaded through dark hair and the kind of steady, unhurried face that makes you lower your shoulders without knowing why. "Mrs. Ashford," she said, "thank you for coming so quickly. I know none of this makes sense yet. It will." She made real tea in real cups, and she did not rush me, and that alone told me more about my husband's judgment than any document could have. Wilbur had spent 30 years among men like Howard, and at the end of his life he had quietly walked away from all of them and put his trust in a woman who worked above a bakery and answered her own door. I sat down across from her, and I let her begin. "I was your husband's attorney for the last several months of his life," Naomi said. "Privately. He came to me about 8 months ago. At first it was a small matter, a question about ownership of certain assets, the sort of thing a man asks when he is putting his affairs in order. But as we talked, it became something much larger. He moved a great deal of his legal business to me, and he did it without telling Howard Pruitt, without telling his children, without telling anyone. He was very clear about that. He said, and I wrote it down because of how he said it, that the people who should have protected you were the very people he needed to protect you from. I held my cup and did not drink. Why would he hide it from his own children? That, she said, is the part I think you already half know. But let me give you the documents first, because once you see them, the rest will be easier to hear. She opened a folder and turned it to face me, and this is the moment the floor of my grief truly began to shift. The will that Desmond had spread across my husband's desk, the one with the small insulting number and the clause that signed away my life, was real. But it was old. Wilbur had written it years ago in a season when his relationship with his children was warmer and his trust in them not yet broken, and it had been a perfectly ordinary will for the man he was then. What Desmond had not told me, what Desmond was praying I would never learn, was that it had been replaced. 11 weeks before he died, my husband had executed a new and final will with Naomi Frost properly witnessed, properly filed, beyond any question of his soundness of mind, and that newer will was the one the law would honor. "The will they showed you is superseded," Naomi said simply. "It has no force. They are relying on you not knowing that a later one exists. Once this one is entered, theirs is so much waste paper." I made myself breathe. "And the new one says what? It leaves the controlling interest in Wren Botanicals to you. The house, the accounts, the larger share of the estate to you. But Mrs. Ashford, I want you to understand that the will is almost the smaller half of what your husband did." She drew out a second set of papers, older stamped, the kind of documents that have sat in registries for years. "Tell me, when you and Wilbur built this company whose name went on the formulas on the trademark," I had to think back. It had been so long ago, and at the time it had seemed like nothing, a piece of paperwork in a stack of paperwork. "Mine," I said slowly. "The first registrations. I remember signing them. Wilbur said because I was the one who created the blends, it was only proper that the inventor hold the rights. I thought he was being kind. I thought it was a sentimental gesture." "It was not sentimental," Naomi said. "It was the most deliberate thing he ever did. The name Wren, the mark itself, the protected formulas at the heart of every product the company sells, all of it is registered to you personally. Harriet Ashford. Not to the company. The company only licenses the right to use them. Do you understand what that means?" I did slowly, the way you understand cold water after you have already stepped into it. It meant that the thing Desmond and Judith Ann believed they were inheriting was a body without a heart. They would get the offices and the equipment and the name on the building, and none of it would be worth anything, because they could not legally sell a single jar under the name Wren, or with the formula inside it, without me. Without my signature, the brand my husband's children were fighting me for could not so much as print a label. "He knew," I said. My voice did not sound like mine. "He knew they would do this. He set it up years ago before any of this so that no matter what they tried, they could never cut me out because the company is worthless without me. He knew, Naomi agreed quietly. He told me he had watched his children all their lives and he loved them, and he had no illusions about them. He said he had built you a door that locked from the inside so that if it ever came to this, you would have somewhere to stand. He wanted you to have the power to choose Harriet. Whatever you decide to do with these people, the choice is yours. They have none. I sat in that small, warm room above the bakery, and I felt 20 years of being called the woman who mixes the creams fall away from me all at once. For the first time since Wilbur died, I was not a widow being managed. I was a person holding the only key to a locked door, and on the other side of it were two people who had been trying to convince me I had no hands. A memory came to me then, uninvited the way the important ones do. Years ago, early on, a lawyer Wilbur had brought to the house. Not Howard, but someone before him had suggested over dinner that it was untidy to have the formulas and the mark in my name, rather than the company's, that it would complicate things if I and Wilbur ever. And here the man had paused delicately parted ways. I remembered Wilbur setting down his glass and saying in a voice I had rarely heard him use, that the day Harriet's name came off, those papers was the day he closed the business, and that the lawyer could either draw up the protections the way Wilbur wanted them or recommend someone who would. I had thought at the time that it was a lovely thing for a husband to say. I had not understood that he was not talking about us at all. He was talking about them. He had been guarding me against his own children for longer than I had ever guessed, and he had done it so gently that I mistook the locks for flowers. I thought in my relief that I understood the whole story now. Greedy children, a hidden will, a clever husband who had outmaneuvered them from the grave. I thought I had reached the bottom of it. I was wrong, and the proof of how wrong was sitting in the bottom of that folder, and Naomi had been waiting with great care for the right moment to lift it out. It was a sealed envelope, thick, the flap taped down and signed across the seam in Wilbur's small square hand. On the front, in the same writing, were words that meant nothing to me. For Harriet. To be opened when you are ready, and not before. Beneath that, as though it were a file label and not a wound, was a name. Maxine Caldwell. "Who is Maxine Caldwell?" I asked. Naomi was quiet for a moment, and I saw her choose her words with more care than she had used for anything else that day. "Your husband left instructions about that envelope that I am bound to follow. He did not want you to learn what is inside it from me secondhand across a desk. He wanted you to hear it from him in his own words, in his own hand. He was very firm. He said you had earned that much to hear it from him, and not from a stranger." She slid the envelope across to me. "I can tell you only this. What is in here is the reason he changed everything. It is the reason his children are in such a hurry, and it is the reason they were tearing his study apart, if that is what you saw. The money was never what frightened them, Mrs. Ashford. This is." I took the envelope. It was heavier than paper should be, the way the pen had been heavier than a pen should be. I did not open it. I want to be truthful about that, because later I asked myself 100 times why I did not simply tear it open in that room, and no. The answer is small and human. I was afraid. I had just gotten my husband back, in a way just learned that he had spent his last strength loving and protecting me, and some animal part of me did not want to read whatever was about to complicate that. A name I did not know in a sealed envelope written in the hand of a man who had kept it from me. I was not ready, so I put it in my bag against my better judgment, and I carried it home unopened, and that decision shaped everything that came after. For 2 days the envelope sat on Wilbur's desk, and I could not bring myself to break the seal. I told myself I was waiting until I was stronger. The truth is that Maxine Caldwell frightened me in a way I could not name, and the longer I left her sealed, the larger she grew. Was she a woman my husband had loved? A debt he had hidden. A child I turned every ugly possibility over in the dark and could not settle on one. And meanwhile the calls from Desmond kept coming 2 and 3 a day, gentle and relentless, asking when I would be ready to come in and finish the paperwork. He had no idea I had been to see Naomi. He still believed the clock was his. Judith Ann called too once, and that call stayed with me. She did not push the way Desmond pushed. She asked how I was sleeping. She asked whether I was eating. There was a long silence in the middle of it, the kind where you can hear a person standing at the edge of saying something true. And then she said in a small voice that did not match the woman who had sat in my workshop with her arms crossed, "Harriet, you know that whatever happens, Dad did love you. You do know that." And before I could answer, she said she had to go, and she was gone. I did not understand it that night. I understood it later. It was the sound of a person trying to apologize for something she had not yet found the courage to stop doing. And that was when I decided to stop being afraid of them and to learn instead exactly how afraid they were of me. Desmond and Corinne invited me to dinner. The invitation came wrapped in so much warmth that it curdled talk of family and healing and putting the difficult days behind us. Corinne cooked or arranged for cooking in their large, bright house in a development where every home pretended to be a small mansion, and she met me at the door with an embrace that did not quite touch me and a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. Desmond poured wine that he announced the price of without being asked. Judith Ann was not there. It was just the three of us in a fourth place that was really for a folder of papers waiting on the sideboard. The papers they still believed I was going to sign. I let them perform for a while. I let them tell me how worried they had been about me, how they only wanted what their father would have wanted, how comfortable I would be once all of this was settled. And then over the main course, with my hands folded in my lap and my voice as mild as I could make it, I began to fish. "I've been going through your father's study," I said, "sorting his papers. It's slow work. He kept everything you know how he was." Desmond made a sympathetic sound. "I keep finding things I don't understand, accounts I'd never heard of, meetings in his calendar with people whose names mean nothing to me." I watched Desmond's fork pause very slightly on its way to his mouth. He was a more private man than I realized at the end. "He got like that when he was sick," Corinne said quickly. "The medication. He wasn't himself." "Maybe," I said, although he seemed perfectly himself to me. I took a small sip of the expensive wine. I did find one thing that puzzled me. A file sealed up with a name on it. I haven't read it yet. I keep meaning to. I let the next words fall as lightly as I knew how. "Caldwell," I think it said. "Do either of you know a Caldwell? I have spent my whole life learning to read the things people do not say. It is half of what makes a marriage last, and all of what makes a good blender of sense, the noticing of what is underneath." So I saw it. I saw Desmond go still in the particular way of a man who has just heard the one word he dreads the stillness that costs effort to hold. I saw Corinne's eyes flick to her husband and away. I saw a single bright drop of panic cross both their faces before they smoothed it over, and I saw Desmond set down his fork with too much care and reach for his wine to give his hands something honest to do. "Doesn't ring a bell," Desmond said. "Probably a vendor. Dad dealt with hundreds of people." And then too fast, too eager the tell that undid him completely. "You really shouldn't waste your time on all that old paper, Harriet. It'll only upset you. Why don't you box it up and let me have it gone through properly? I'll send someone." There it was. They did not want me reading my own husband's files. They wanted the paper gone handled removed from my hands. And the only thing in all those files that could make a man go pale at his own dinner table was a sealed envelope with a name on it that he had just sworn meant nothing to him. I could have stopped there. I had what I came for. But I was 64 years old, and I had been patronized in that house for the last time, so I pressed once more lightly the way you press a bruise to be sure it is real. "It's strange," I said almost to myself. He sealed it himself, taped it down and signed across the seal the way you do when you don't want a thing opened by accident. I looked up at Desmond with the most harmless expression I owned. "Why would your father seal a vendor file?" The silence that followed had a texture to it. Corinne rose too quickly and began clearing plates that were not finished. Desmond laughed a short sound with nothing behind it and said something about how I knew his father always making mysteries out of nothing and would I like coffee. I said no thank you. I should be getting home, the roads were dark. And as I gathered my coat, I watched the two of them exchange one last look across the ruined dinner, a look that did not include me, a look I had seen pass between them before in the workshop the day they came to take everything. It was the look of two people checking without words whether the other one had given anything away. I told him I would think about the papers. I thanked Corinne for the lovely meal. I left the folder on the sideboard unsigned, and I drove home through the dark with my heart beating hard and steady because I no longer had any doubt at all. Whatever they were so desperate to bury, whatever had sent them crawling through Wilbur's drawers at midnight, whatever had made my husband rewrite his entire life 11 weeks before he died, it had a name, and the name was waiting for me sealed on his desk. I opened the envelope the night I came home from that dinner. I had run out of reasons to be afraid of it. Whatever was inside could not be worse than the things I now knew Wilbur's children were willing to do, and so I sat in his chair under his lamp, and I broke the seal he had signed across with his own hand, and I began to read. It was a long letter, 6 pages in his small square writing, and the first line undid me before I had taken a breath. My dearest Harriet. It began, "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have found the one part of my life I never had the courage to tell you while I was alive. I am sorry for that. Read all of it before you judge me, and know that I loved you through every word." He told me about a girl named Sylvia Caldwell. He had loved her when he was young, 23, 24 years old, long before Wren, long before his first marriage, long before me. They had been the kind of young and poor and serious that you only get to be once. But he was building something in those years, working himself half to death, the way ambitious young men do. And she was offered a position in another city, and neither of them knew yet that love is a thing you are supposed to protect rather than expect to survive on its own. They argued. They drifted. The distance did what distance does. By the time the dust settled, they had let each other go, both of them too proud to be the one who called, and Sylvia moved away for good, and Wilbur threw himself into work, and told himself it was for the best. What he did not know, what he swore to me on those pages he had not known, was that Sylvia left already carrying his child. She found out only after she had gone, and by then she had convinced herself in the way the young can that he had never truly loved her, that he had let her leave because he was glad to. And so she made a decision that shaped 3 lives. She did not tell him. She raised the baby alone in a city far from his, a daughter she named Maxine, and she never wrote, and she never called, and she let Wilbur go on with his life, believing the chapter had closed clean. He married. He had Desmond and then Judith Ann. Their mother died when the children were grown. And years after that, a woman walked into his company building who knew far more about how to make a stranger feel beautiful than anyone gave her credit for, and he married her, and her name was me. And in all of it, across 48 years, he never knew that his first child was alive in the world growing up, growing old, carrying his face into rooms he would never see. He learned only at the end. That was the part of the letter that made me set it down and press my hands over my mouth. Sylvia was dying. Cancer, the kind that does not bargain, and as it took her, she found that she could not carry the secret into the ground with her. She had robbed her daughter of a father out of a young woman's wounded pride, and she would not let death make it permanent. So she came to find Wilbur, to give the two of them whatever time was left to say the thing she should have said half a lifetime before. She came to his company, the letter said, on an afternoon when he was not there. And that Wilbur wrote is where it all went wrong, because the person who met her at the door was not me and was not him. It was Desmond. I did not understand reading it that night, everything that sentence held. I understood it fully only after I had gone to find Maxine herself, which I did 3 days later because once I knew she was real, I could not stay away. She lived 200 miles north in a small, tidy town, in a small, tidy house with a garden that someone tended with care. I had told myself on the long drive that I would be careful. I had spent the whole way arguing with the worst version of the story. Perhaps Sylvia's daughter was exactly what Desmond would have called her, a stranger who had found a dying rich man and worked her way into his sympathies and his will. Perhaps the children, monstrous as they were, had stumbled onto a real threat and dealt with it the only ugly way they knew. I am not proud of having thought it, but I had been hurt enough by then to expect the worst of everyone, and I knocked on her door braced for a woman who would lie to me. The woman who answered was 48 years old, and she had Wilbur's eyes. Not similar, his. The same particular brown, the same way of crinkling at the edges when she was uncertain which she was deeply the moment she saw me. I knew before she said a word. You cannot fake a face. I had looked at that face across a pillow for 20 years, watched it laugh and sleep and finally fail. And here it was again, younger, softer, a woman's version of it looking out at me from a doorway in a town I had never been to. Every suspicion I had nursed on the drive up simply stopped, the way a clock stops all at once and without ceremony. There are some lies a face will not tell, and that face was telling me before either of us spoke that it belonged to my husband's blood. "You're Harriet," she said. It was not a question. "He told me about you. He said you were the best thing that ever happened to him, and that he was sorry I would never get to know you." Her voice broke on the last of it. "I didn't think you'd ever come. I assumed they'd made sure of that." I went inside and she made tea in real cups, the same small courtesy Naomi had shown me, and over it the whole truth came out, and it was not the truth I had braced for. It was so much worse and so much cleaner than anything I had imagined. Maxine had never wanted a penny. She told me that first before I could even wonder it, because she had spent the last months of her life being accused of it, and she could not bear to see the suspicion form in one more pair of eyes. Her mother had been the one who reached out. Maxine had not even known growing up who her father was. She found out only when Sylvia got sick and decided to make her amends. And when Sylvia went to Wilbur's company that afternoon to begin it gently to ask him to call to give the two of them a chance, she had the bad luck to meet Desmond at the door. He didn't know who she was, Maxine said. Not at first, but she got flustered. She was a dying woman trying to find an old love and tell him he had a daughter, and a sharp young man was suddenly asking her what she wanted, and she panicked and said she was only an old acquaintance and left, and that was enough for him. Maxine wrapped both hands around her cup. Desmond never could stand a loose thread. He had her followed. His assistant, I think. They learned she had a daughter. They found a photograph of me. She gave a small, terrible laugh. And I look so much like him, Harriet. You've seen it. One look at my picture and Desmond knew exactly what his father's old acquaintance had come to say. This was the thing I had crossed 200 miles braced against, and it turned out to be the opposite of what I feared. Maxine was not the threat. Maxine was the thing they were afraid of the same way they were afraid of me, and for the same reason. We were both people who could take something they believed was theirs. They had simply gotten to her first. What did they do? I asked, though I think I already knew the shape of it. They had come to her. Desmond and Judith Ann, both though it was Desmond who spoke. They confirmed what they suspected the cheapest way a person can by getting hold of something of hers and running it against their father, and when it came back, the way they feared, they made her an offer. Money to stay away. A sum in writing in exchange for her silence and her absence on the condition that she never contact Wilbur, never make a claim, never exist as far as the family was concerned. And when she refused because she had never come for money and would not be paid to abandon a father, she had only just learned she had the offer curdled into something else. Threats. Warnings about what they could do, what they could say about her, how easily a woman with no money and no name could be painted as exactly the schemer they would call her. They told her Maxine said that if she persisted, they would make sure her father died believing she was a con artist who had come to rob him. "And then my mother died," Maxine said quietly. "And I thought, that's it. They've won. I'll never even meet him." But I couldn't let her have done all that for nothing. So I went around them. I wrote to him directly at the house, a letter, and I prayed one of them didn't get to the mail first. She looked up at me, and there were tears standing in Wilbur's eyes set in her face. He called me the next morning. He was already so sick by then. And he said, "Maxine, is it really you?" And I said yes. And he said, "I have spent my whole life not knowing you, and I do not have much of it left, but you will have all of it that I do." That was the moment the last of my defenses came down, because I knew sitting in that small, bright kitchen that everything Desmond had told the world was a lie built backward. He had not protected his father from a predator. He had discovered a sister decided she was a threat to his inheritance, tried to buy her silence, failed, and then set about making certain that a dying man's reunion with his lost child would be poisoned, hidden, and erased. And when even that failed, when Wilbur learned the truth and met his daughter and loved her anyway, the children did the last thing they had left to do. They buried it. I learned how when I went back to Naomi and we went through the rest of the file together, the file Wilbur had built in his final weeks once he understood what his own children were. It was all there, documented with the patient care of a man who had spent a lifetime keeping good records. In those last weeks, as he failed Desmond and Judith Ann had moved in close around him, not out of love but to control what reached him. They managed his visitors. They intercepted Maxine's calls and turned her away when she tried to come. And on one occasion, the file noted in Wilbur's own dry hand, they told the nurse that the woman at the gate was a known scam artist who had been harassing the family, so that the nurse herself would send Maxine away and feel virtuous doing it. They fed him fabricated things, a folder dressed up to look like proof that Maxine had a history of preying on older men, pages of half-invented history meant to make a sick man doubt the daughter he had just found. They did it while I was worn down to nothing, sleeping in 2-hour pieces, too exhausted from keeping my husband alive to notice that his children were quietly building walls around his bed. I had thought in those weeks that it was sweet of them to come so often. I had been grateful. I had made them coffee. And in the legal dark, they had made sure the old Will, the one that knew nothing of Maxine, and left me with scraps, was the only one anyone would ever see, never dreaming that their father had already gone to a woman above a bakery and written a new one that buried theirs. But here is the part I will carry with me, until my own end, the part Wilbur set down in the last pages of his letter, and that Maxine confirmed through her tears. They did not win the thing they most wanted to prevent. For all their walls, they could not keep him from her entirely. Near the very end, when he no longer cared what his children allowed, Wilbur sent them out of the house on an errand that would take a whole afternoon, and he had Naomi bring Maxine to him through the back. And for 1 hour, one single hour, a father and the daughter he had never known sat together in a quiet room. Maxine told me about it slowly, because she had only had the 1 hour, and she had spent the month since turning it over and over so it would not wear away. He had been propped up in the bed by then, thin in the way the very sick are thin, but his eyes were clear. She said clearer than she had let herself hope. He took her hand the moment she sat down, and he did not let go of it the whole hour. He told her he was sorry, and when she said he had nothing to be sorry for, that he had not even known, he said that was exactly the thing he was sorry for, that a man should know his own child, and he had been cheated of 48 years of her, and she of him. And that the cheating did not become acceptable just because neither of them had chosen it. He asked her about her life. He wanted all of it greedily, the whole 48 years at once, her school, her work, the garden, whether she had been happy, whether her mother had been happy. He laughed when she told him she could not sit still and always had 3 projects going, and he said that was him. That was exactly him and her grandmother before him. He held her hand against his cheek, and he said she had Sylvia's stubbornness and his own bad habit of working too hard, and her grandmother's hands. And then he said the thing she repeated to me twice because she could not believe she had been given it. He told her not to be afraid of what his children would do because he had already made certain in writing with someone they could not reach that the truth of her would outlive him no matter how hard they tried to bury it. He said, "I cannot give you the years, but I can give you this. I can make sure that when I am gone, you cannot be erased." And then, because he was who he was, he made her promise that she would not let the fight over a company turn her into someone bitter, that whatever came, she would remember she had been wanted in the end by her father completely. She was the last person besides me and the nurse to see him truly himself. 3 days later, he was gone, and his children began arranging the funeral and the lie and the papers they would push across his own desk at his widow, certain that the secret had died in that house with him. It had not. It was sitting in a sealed envelope under his lamp, and it was sitting in a file above a bakery, and it was sitting across a kitchen table from me, 200 miles from home, pouring tea with her father's hands. And as I drove south again that evening, I was no longer a frightened widow, and I was no longer even only an angry one. I was the keeper of a truth that 2 people had spent everything to bury, and I had finally understood what my husband had been asking me to do. He had not left me a weapon to take revenge. He had left me a truth and trusted me to decide what it deserved. I went back to Naomi the next morning and I asked her the only question that mattered. "What do I actually have?" I said. "Not what I feel, what I can prove." She laid it out for me with the patience of a woman who had been waiting for me to be ready to hear it. I had 2 things, and either one alone would have been enough, and together they were absolute. I had the new will valid, witnessed, filed, leaving me control of everything, and acknowledging Maxine as Wilbur's daughter, a will that turned the document Desmond kept waving at me into so much scrap paper. And I had Wilbur's file, the patient record of everything his children had done, the offer they had put to Maxine in writing to pay for her disappearance, the messages in which they threatened her, the folder of fabricated history they had built to poison a dying man against his own child. None of it was my invention. All of it was theirs, preserved by a husband who had seen exactly what they were and decided that the truth should be heavier than their lies. "You could end them," Naomi said simply, "if you wanted to. The concealment alone, the fraud, the defamation. You could put this in front of people who would make their lives very small for a very long time. The choice is yours. It was always going to be yours." That is what he wanted. And I thought of Wilbur in that bed holding his daughter's hand, making her promise she would not let any of this turn her bitter. I thought of what he had asked of me in the last line of his letter, which I have not told you yet, because I was saving it. He had written at the very bottom of the 6th page, "Do not become them in the act of beating them. Give them the truth, Harriet, and let the truth decide what they deserve." You were always better at this than I was, so I did not call the authorities. Not first. I called Desmond and I told him in a small, defeated voice I did not have to work very hard to fake that he was right, that I was tired, that I could not fight him, and that I would come in at the end of the week and sign whatever he put in front of me, if he would only let it all be over. I heard the triumph go through him down the line, warm and ugly. He said, "Of course, Harriet, it was always going to come to this," and he was glad I had finally seen sense. He arranged the meeting at Pruitt and Associates for Friday morning. He did not know I was bringing 2 guests of my own. And that is how we come back to where I began, to the conference room that smelled of polish and cold coffee, and the pen that was heavier than a pen has any right to be. They were all there. Desmond in his beautiful suit, Judith Ann folding the corner of a page, Corinne with her glass of water, Howard Pruitt presiding with his grave and practiced kindness. They had drawn up a waiver, a tidy document in which I surrendered every claim I had to the company, to the name to all of it, in accordance, the paper said, with the last will and testament of Wilbur Ashford. Howard slid it across to me and told me I was doing the sensible thing, so I signed. I gave the greedy heirs exactly what they had asked me for. I wrote my small name at the bottom of their paper, and I watched Desmond allow himself that smile, and Judith Ann let out her held breath, and for one moment they had everything, and they believed it. Then the door opened and Naomi Frost walked in with her folder. Desmond's smile curdled at the edges. "Who is this?" "This is my attorney," I said. "My private attorney. I think you'll want to hear what she has to say before you celebrate." Naomi sat. She did not hurry. She opened her folder and she began to read, and the first thing she read was the date of a will, not the date on the document I had just signed away my rights to. A later date, 11 weeks before Wilbur died. I watched Howard Pruitt's face begin its long, slow change as she read, because Howard, whatever else he was, knew what a later date meant. "The waiver Mrs. Ashford just signed," Naomi said pleasantly, "releases her claims under the will of which you have a copy. I should tell you that that will was revoked by your father 11 weeks before his death. It has no force. You have had her sign away her rights to a document that no longer legally exists. It changes nothing." She let that settle into the silence. "This is the operative will," and she read it aloud. She read that the controlling interest in Wren Botanicals passed to Harriet Ashford. She read that the trademark and the protected formulas had never belonged to the company at all, but to me personally, so that the business they thought they were inheriting could not legally print a label or sell a jar without my signature. Desmond's face had gone the color of the cold coffee. And then Naomi reached the line, the single sentence I had crossed a state to understand, and she read it without raising her voice at all. "And to my daughter Maxine Caldwell, whom I wronged for 48 years through no fault of her own, I leave my acknowledgement, my name, and the provisions set out below, in the hope that the world will know her at last for what she has always been, which is mine." That was the sentence. That was when the blood drained out of Howard Pruitt's face until he looked like a man who had just understood he had spent the last month working very hard for the wrong people. And that was when the conference room door opened a second time, and Maxine Caldwell walked in, 48 years old, with her father's eyes, and stood at the end of the table where every one of them could see exactly whose face she wore. Nobody spoke. Corinne made a small sound. Judith Ann had gone absolutely white, staring at Maxine the way you stare at a thing you have spent months pretending does not exist, and have just watched walk through a door. "You knew," I said. I was not asking. I laid the rest of it on the table, then page by page the offer they had written to pay her, to vanish the threats, the folder of lies they had built to turn a dying man against his own blood, the record of how they had turned his daughter away at his own gate, while he lay inside not knowing she had come. "You knew before he did. You found her, and you tried to buy her, and when she would not be bought, you tried to make sure your father died, believing she was a thief. You built walls around a dying man so his own child could not reach him. And then you came to his widow and called it family. Desmond, I will give him this, did not crumble. Desmond never crumbled. He sat very straight, and he said in the cold, flat voice underneath all the smooth ones, 'None of that is admissible. You can't prove I wrote any of it. This is a grieving woman's fantasy and a stranger's, and a lawyer she's paying.' He had already moved past shock into calculation. That was who he was all the way down. There was no part of him that was sorry. There was only the part that was working out the angles. But that was the moment his sister broke. 'Stop it, Desmond.' Judith Ann's voice cracked on his name. She was crying, and not prettily the way a person cries when something they have been holding for months finally tears. 'Stop. I can't. I can't do this anymore.' She turned to Maxine and to me, and the words came out of her in a rush like water through a broken wall. 'We did it. All of it. He planned it, and I went along with it because I was scared, and because I told myself it wasn't really happening, that we were protecting the family that she was, after the money. But I knew. I knew the day we turned her away from the gate. I knew when Dad asked for her, and we told him she'd stopped coming. I have not slept. I have not slept since he died, because the last thing my father ever asked me for was his daughter, and I lied to his face and told him she didn't want to come. She pressed her hand over her mouth and then took it away. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. It's all true. Every page of it is true, and I'll say so to anyone you want me to. You cannot calculate your way out of your own sister telling the truth. Desmond looked at Judith Ann, and for the first time in his life, I watched him understand that there was no angle left, because the witness who could undo him was sitting at his own table sobbing and would not be stopped. I had come into that room able to choose mercy, and I did choose it, but not the kind they were hoping for. I told them the truth I had decided on the long drive home from Maxine's kitchen. The company was mine, and I would be keeping it. The name and the formulas had always been mine, and no court in the world would take them off me. They could walk away quietly, both of them, with the modest provision their father had left them, despite everything, and acknowledge Maxine publicly as what she was, and in return I would not be the one to drag the rest of it into a courtroom or a newspaper. Or they could fight me and discover exactly how much of their father's careful file the world was willing to read. Judith Ann took the quiet path, and she did more than take it. She went to Maxine later and asked if there was any version of a future in which a sister who had wronged her so badly might earn the smallest piece of her forgiveness, not owed, only hoped for. Maxine, who had every right to send her away, did not. That is its own story and not mine to tell. Desmond did not take the quiet path. Desmond to the end believed he could win, and a man who will not stop denying a thing his own sister has confessed to forces other people's hands. What happened to him after that happened in offices I was not part of, in proceedings that took their slow course, and I will only say that the file my husband built was thorough, and that a man cannot threaten a woman in writing and fabricate a fraud against his own father and walk away clean simply because he has a good suit and a steady voice. He lost the company he had schemed for, which had never really been his to lose. He lost a great deal more than that. Corinne did not stay to watch it. I am told she went to her sister's and did not come back. And Maxine wanted none of it. She told me so plainly in the days after when the lawyers wanted to know what she would claim. She did not want the company or the house, or a war over an inheritance she had never come looking for. What she had wanted, the only thing she had ever wanted, was to be her father's daughter out loud in the world, where it could not be erased, and the will had given her that, and that was enough. She took the provision Wilbur left her modest and deliberate, and she went home to her garden 200 miles north. We did not become a family, she and I. I want to be honest about that, because the easy ending would be to tell you that we fell into each other's arms and filled the holes in each other's lives, and that is not what happened, and it would dishonor both of us to pretend. We were two women who had loved the same man in completely different ways, who had each been wronged by the same people, and who had met too late to be anything as simple as mother and daughter, or even friends. But we parted with a respect that has lasted. She sends me cuttings from her garden in the spring. I send her the first jar from every new batch. We do not pretend to be more than we are, and somehow that has made the little we are feel honest and durable in a way that forced closeness never could. As for me, I kept Wren Botanicals and I rebuilt it the way I had always wanted to, and never been allowed slowly with my own hands at the center of it, instead of pushed to the back like the woman who mixes the creams. And in the second year, I opened a second small workshop, a teaching one where I take women that the world has decided are finished, women in their 60s and 70s who have spent their lives being told their hands belong in the background, and I teach them this old patient craft of plants, the one thing nobody can take off you once it lives in your hands. There is a brass plaque by the door with Wilbur's name on it, and under it a line I chose myself. It says the truth outlives the people who try to bury it. I sit in my workshop most evenings now the way I used to, with the amber bottles in a row and the smell of green things around me. And sometimes I think about the morning the funeral flowers were still fresh, and I believed I had lost everything. I had not lost everything. I had a husband who loved me enough to lock the door from the inside years before I knew there would ever be a wolf. I had a truth worth keeping, and I had a choice at the end about who I would become in the keeping of it, and I would like to believe I chose the way he hoped I would. So now I will ask you, because I have wondered about it more than once in the quiet. If you had been the one holding that file with the power to end them, or the power to let the truth decide, which would you have chosen? Would you have given the greedy heirs exactly what they asked for and let them learn what it was worth? Tell me where you are watching from, and tell me what you would have done. I have learned late in life that the answer says a great deal about a person.